Hello and welcome to Arcadology, a podcast focused on video game history and design. My name is Kevin, and today we will be speaking with God of War narrative designer Adam Dolin. I've known Adam for a long time and was delighted to get a chance to speak with him about his efforts working on the new God of War game. We also spoke a bit about his path on getting into the games industry. A fair warning, we will be spoiling bits of the main quest of God of War. Now, on with the show. Because your name is like right there on that first page of credits.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy, huh? I definitely wasn't expecting that. I remember playing through it and finishing. It was like in January, and I had like a month on the contract left, and it was the first time I saw the credits. And yeah, it was like the first page, and it's bonkers.
Yeah, no,
it's bonkers.
I totally, because obviously we have mutuals from SCAD, and we'll be sitting there in the movie and be like, oh, I know that person, but normally for like a SCAD person, it's like way down the list on like, oh, they did the motion graphics capture or something like
right, and it's also among like 50 or 60
other people.
Other names, because so many people are required to make one single frame of animation.
Yeah. So I was pretty happy to see your name up there, because I was like, oh, there's Corey Barlog,
I know that guy.
And there's Adam.
Yeah. Yeah, man.
There's the guy who's doing all these interviews, and then hey, I know that guy.
Yeah. I'm right there.
We can get started on the formal questions that I had sent over to you.
Well, it segs into your first question.
Yeah. Like, how did you actually
I got there?
Yeah, how did you get your start in the industry?
Well, so I went to SCAD like you, mm-hmm. and at the end of those 4 years, I have to start. It's hard to start this story anywhere from other than the very beginning, because I'm pretty easy to find online, and I've had a lot of people, like you said, I'm right there on the first page, right. And people are trying to figure out how to break into writing for games. So people find me on LinkedIn and they send me like, how did you get your start? And so eventually a friend suggested to just write up a boilerplate response of like, here's my entire history of how I got to this point. Right. And it's not a traditional history, but I think if you asked 6 different game writers, you'd get 6 different answers.
Right.
I finished up SCAD, and right before we were graduating, I applied for an internship in Los Angeles at a voiceover studio called Technicolor Interactive. They're no longer around, but they focus primarily on recording dialogue for games and contract sound work for games. And so I interviewed for it, and I got it, and I moved to LA a couple weeks after college. So that was really exciting. I really had no plans to go to LA. I didn't really know what I was going to do after college, just look for work. And I ended up finding, this internship. I got really lucky because the studio was in the middle of working on Uncharted 2 and Mass Effect 2. So like the first day of my internship, I think I edited dialogue for Uncharted 2 and I printed scripts for a Mass Effect 2 session.
So you were right into AAA, like right then and there.
Yeah, and not only AAA, like good AAA games, like high quality AAA titles, working with really good talent, and sort of understanding the flow of a voiceover session and what went on in it, and seeing the pipeline, or at least one section of the pipeline of dialogue in games. That internship lasted just under a year, maybe a little over a year. It's rough out there for the contract voiceover recording studios. Right. You see studios sort of fold and get brought up again because the work is inconsistent. So that's what happened with that job. And then I moved on to sort of freelance work, and I was freelancing as a dialogue editor for a long time because with the sound design degree that I had from SCAD, I knew Pro Tools, and that's what all the voiceover studios used. And if you're good at Pro Tools and if you're a fast dialogue editor, it's not terribly difficult to find people who need you, because these games today generate a lot of dialogue.
Right.
And nobody wants to edit it because it's a really tedious work.
Right.
And just scrubbing through the waveform and finding the mouth noises and the clicks. And as I'm sure you know, editing a podcast, like doing it for too long, it's a little mind numbing.
Oh, totally.
Yeah. And so I did that for a while and developed a good ear, and also got to know what game scripts looked like and what good dialogue was, what bad dialogue was, who the good actors were. I ended up working for a studio whose client was 2K, and they were working on a game called The Darkness 2, which was not a very well-known game. I don't think it did very well. But the client, this guy, Jack Scalisi, and he's a creative director over there, and he's kind of a mob. He's a character from a video game. If you're going to have like a mob boss character, this would be Jack Scalisi. And he, it was a weird gig. I've never had a gig since of like a overnight editing session, where they recorded dialogue that day and they needed night editors to edit it and deliver it that night because they were so on crunch. And so he and he was also there because he's a man who doesn't sleep and drinks, 6 Red Bulls a day.
Right.
And was like in the studio with me while I was editing, which was also a first, and kind of putting me through my paces a little bit, like correcting my edits. And, if I had a bigger ego, I probably would have like fought back a little bit and be like, why don't you just let me do this?
Yeah.
But I kept my mouth shut.
I think anybody who's been in the video production or game production
or graphic design,
you all have that experience of sitting there with the over the shoulder client edit.
Yeah. Well, you're paying me, so whatever you want, sir. Anyways, he took a shine to me because I was pretty easygoing, and ended up sort of taking me under his wing a bit. And for a year or two, I was sort of a Swiss Army knife in the audio department for 2K, sort of for hire for different studios. I worked at Firaxis for a while on the XCOM game, the Enemy Unknown.
Right.
And I worked on Evolve for a while as an implementer, and did some like mastering stuff for Spec Ops, just a bunch of 2K titles.
Right.
And that kept me fed for close to 3 years, I think.
Well, being fed is good.
Yeah. I mean, it wasn't what I wanted to do. I wanted to write. And I was meeting writers, and I was working with scripts, and I was very close to that world, but just not there yet. But what I did get to write was like a bunch of battle chatter. I've written maybe like 4 battle chatter scripts for different titles because, again, nobody wants to do it.
Right.
It's very tedious. So I got better at that and seeing more of the pipeline coming into focus of writers writing it, script supervisors getting it ready to send to the client or to the voiceover studios, the studios recording it, editing it, sending it back, and then implementing it. At that point, I was commuting from Silver Lake to Irvine every day, and really was not happy with that. It's about an hour and 10-minute commute.
Yikes. Yeah, that's kind of bad.
So I was looking for something else, and a friend of mine, actually my first manager at Technicolor, Julia Scheffling, who just opened up a new voiceover network. One of her clients was Sledgehammer Games, and they were looking for a dialogue coordinator, basically the guy who is the go-between the writers and the voiceover studio and the implementers. So somebody who oversees dialogue from its inception at the writing stage to its recording, which includes casting, the editing, the deliveries, and then implementation. I had done most of those skills before, but in different ways.
Right.
Never like all together in one role. So I knew it was going to be a challenge, and they were also, crunching. So, and it was a Call of Duty game, which is not my bag, but it's also, a large AAA title. And it seemed like an obvious choice. Then at that point, the game had shipped. My contract was coming to an end. I was working up in the Bay Area, and I wanted to go back to Los Angeles for many reasons, but mostly just because the Bay Area is really expensive and all my friends were in LA.
Right.
So I was looking for something, didn't see any like dialogue coordinating jobs, but my friend Julia mentioned that one of our former clients at Technicolor, Jackie Shriver, was the casting manager at Sony PlayStation. I had known Jackie for a long time, and she was actually up in the Bay Area for GDC that year. And so I ran into her and was like, hey, heard you're looking for casting help. And she said, yeah, send me your resume. We'll talk when I get back. And I got that job, moved back down to LA, and ended up casting God of War and Spider-Man and a bunch of other different titles that are still in development.
So the new, you're talking about the new Spider-Man, the one that was just shown off at E3?
Yeah, it was cool. It was, I did that for about 2 years. I coordinated a lot of auditions. Our office is in Sony Santa Monica, which also houses the God of War team. I helped them cast that game, and I got to meet Matt and Rich, the writers, and Corey. And I didn't work with them too often, but I coordinated their audition, so they knew me anytime we held an audition or anytime we were doing face scans. I got to interact with them a little bit. One of our clients, Insomniac, they were casting Spider-Man, and I got to know the writer and creative director, John Paquette and Brian Intihar, pretty well, because they came in a lot. We held a lot of auditions for Spider-Man because they have a pretty large cast. And John mentioned that they were hiring a writer for Spider-Man. So I took a weekend and I wrote up like a spec script because I really didn't have much of a portfolio.
Right.
So I had just been playing Arkham City. No, wait. What's the third? Arkham Knight.
Arkham Knight.
I just been playing Arkham Knight and wrote like a spec script mission for Arkham Knight just as part of the portfolio.
Right.
And on top of that, I had like an animation pilot that I'd written and like the battle chatter script that I wrote for Evolve. And so I applied for that job, didn't get it, but maybe a month later, one of the producers of God of War walks into the casting office and says, hey, we're looking for a writer for God of War. We need somebody who is going to be on site and is okay with a short-term contract. And so I kind of just raised my hand.
You're like, hey, I said, already did the portfolio work.
Yeah, I am a writer, and here you go. And so I sent it to Matt and Rich. They looked it over, and they'd known me before because they'd seen my face. So I think that helped too, knowing that I was a familiar face, familiar with the material. And they liked the spec, so they brought me on board. And that is a extremely long answer for how I got my start.
Yeah, but it makes sense because it's kind of a twisty and turny thing, and I feel like you can't really. It's not the simple answer that a lot of people hope for, but it's the honest answer.
Yeah, and
you have to be honest with people when they're trying to break into things. Here's what to expect.
And break in is a good way to put it because I fought for a long time to get to this position, and I think the trick is for people who are looking for a way to get in is to to take a job you might not want, but if you're close to. If that job is in proximity, even whether it's like physical proximity to a job that you want, that helps.
Right.
Because opportunities do pop up.
Right.
And it can happen when you least expect it.
Yeah, that's awesome. Titles, I've noticed, I've been doing a lot of research into the history of development, video game development. It's on my YouTube channel. And I feel like titles are often kind of nebulous in the game industry.
Yeah.
A producer for one game, a producer in Japan is different than a producer in the United States. And over time, they've shifted. What meant something in the 80s and 90s doesn't mean the same thing today. So what could you tell me, what does a narrative designer do in your position?
They brought me on originally when they told me that they needed a writer. They needed mostly combat banter and a little bit of exploration is what they said. That turned out to be all the combat banter and then like 10 hours of gameplay and exploration. If you've played God of War, you'll notice that there's a lot of exploration in the game. And there's a lot of dialogue when you're going around exploring. I do want to say right off the bat that all of the wonderful Mimir stories that you hear while boating around, I did not write those. That was Orion Walker. He wrote the bulk of those. So I need to give credit where credit is due.
Right.
But all of these side quests and labors and Valkyries and all of these things were still sort of in development when I joined up.
Right.
And the idea of like when the first quest would be available, what would happen if you went to this area and this thing has happened already.
Right.
You'll notice sometimes when you play a certain quest, they'll refer to something that has happened. If you play it at different times in the main quest, they'll say slightly different dialogue.
Right. I've actually noticed that from my playthrough and then watching somebody else's playthrough, they approached a side quest at a much different time. I believe it was the Alchemist, which is one of the first. It's
the Brock one.
It's Brock's first request is for you to go get this Alchemist ring. And I remember watching, and they went to it much later. They just said they just skipped it and they just kept going with the. And I noticed there were little changes to the dialogue. We're like, oh, that's neat. That's cool. That's a nice attention to detail to keep track that things have happened.
Yeah. So that's sort of the answer to your question. Is you kind of have to. This game was enormous. It just got bigger and bigger, and certain lines of dialogue that you write on your first draft and that carry on and then get recorded, and then things will change in design to make things more fun. I think, for instance, the quest where you have to go collect all the bones. Mm-hmm. That was initially 5 bones. And so after each bone, there would be a conversation. Right. And then in playtest, people were saying, 5 bones is a little too many bones, which, at the time I was like, now I have to cut my quest in half. But looking back on it, totally the right move.
Right.
I think and this was a question I was asked in the interview recently, is like, what do you think the difference between writer and designer and narrative designer is? And there were 2 quests, the Valkyrie quest and the final Dwarven favor that are very tricky in terms of their design.
Right.
I'm gonna put a spoiler alert here, I guess. So for the Valkyries, there are 8 of them before you fight the queen, and there's a narrative plot that runs along all of them. So you fight one, you defeat one, you have a conversation, starts a mystery. The next one you talk to continues that thread. It's a linear narrative path. But you can fight those Valkyries in any order you want.
Right.
So the challenge there became, how do you tell a story when any of these Valkyries can speak at any different time?
Right.
And the way I ended up solving that was making a giant flow chart of, well, if you go to this one first, she'll give the first line. And then if you go to this one next, she'll give the next line. And then figuring out basically that we had to get every Valkyrie actress to record every one of those different lines. And then trigger, based on how many you defeated, trigger the next line. And so it was kind of a large undertaking between myself and Anthony Demento, who's the systems designer, who sort of ended up being the quest, one of the lead quest designers, really our only quest designer, who helped me sort of figure out how this would work technically.
Right.
But it was a lot of design, of straight design work with flowcharts, of figuring out the mechanics of the order of how these things would go down.
Yeah.
So I think, I don't know if that earns me a design credit, but there is more than just strict linear narrative thinking.
No, totally. That makes a lot of sense. And actually, the flowchart that you mentioned, it reminds me a little bit of something that they used to call and they might still call it, a puzzle dependency chart in graphic adventure games. they would have these basically just a giant chart with boxes and lines, and like Sierra and LucasArts used to use these. Basically, you had to have triggered this for this to happen, but if you're coming at it from this angle, it has to come from this way. So basically, you have a dependency that needs to trigger before this thing happens.
Yes.
So that's it kind of sparked that in my mind.
I also did, and I'm hesitant to talk about it too much because I'm not 100% thrilled with how it came out, but I think it's okay.
Sure.
All the combat banter that you hear.
Right.
I designed or working with really strong tools. A guy named Victor Sepeda built this banter tool that let me time out and set certain conditions for when certain lines would play.
So is this like when Atreus would say certain lines during combat?
Correct. And, I've just been playing through it recently myself, and game development is a lot of crunching at the end, especially a game this size. And there's unfortunately not enough time or at least I didn't have enough time to sit and just play through the game and think about how it sounded playing through it, for 3 hours at a time, which a lot of us do. We have bugs to solve. So there's a lot of timing things I think I would have changed if I had the chance to go back. But there are a few things that worked out really well. For instance, you get to like a really easy fight, a couple joggers, you take them down quickly, and Atreus says, "Oh, they barely touched us."
Right.
And then I have that, you won't hear that for another 2 or 3 hours at most.
Right.
So those are sort of design decisions that I think also contribute to that next step of designer.
And obviously the banter, if I recall correctly, the banter, some of it, the tenor of the banter reflected where you were on the main quest.
Yeah.
Without giving away too much, there's certain ways that lines are said that vary over the course of the game.
That's correct.
Because of the main quest. So I thought that was handled pretty well, because there would have been a bit of a dissonance if the banter was either fearful or upbeat, if certain things are happening, and especially when Atreus is kind of in
jerk mode. We call it jerk mode. Yeah. Jerk mode. Or sometimes it was called God mode.
Right.
And I'm glad that you noticed that. It wasn't really until late in the process where I started to get really comfortable with those tools.
Right.
And use those sort of things. And, we recorded a ton of combat banter with Sonny, the actor. Mm-hmm. But there's always stuff that you miss, and there's always things that would have been better. And, you just run out of time.
Yeah.
But there was something that I don't know if people have picked up on this. A lot of his sort of cooldowns, I think especially like his arrow callouts, like "I'm ready."
Right.
I progressively lengthen the cooldowns on those the longer you go in the game. So towards the end of the game, you shouldn't hear some of his more frequent callouts quite as frequently.
That makes sense. I mean, from a narrative point of view, you can say that they're able to communicate more without actually talking to each other.
It's funny you say that.
Yeah.
Because that was the initial pitch of their combat banter, was Atreus's moods would shift as you go forward, and by the end, he would be a veteran, where there wouldn't need to be too much communication between the two of them.
Right.
Where that got tricky is that Kratos doesn't really talk very much in combat.
Yeah.
So there was not a lot of back and forth going on between those guys.
Right. And I imagine adding a third voice in Mimir, did that help balance that out at all?
Yes. But he doesn't show up for, the first 10 hours of the game or something like that. So,
depending on your difficulty.
Exactly. Or how much exploration you do.
Right.
But absolutely, when Mimir shows up, it definitely takes a lot of pressure off of Sonny.
Yeah, and honestly, that was actually one of the things I remember noting to myself, that there are so many games where you have an escort CPU character, sort of like Atreus, that you just hate the character by the end. And Atreus is so rare that you actually except for a brief moment at around, I don't know, hour 30.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's you start to become more and more endeared with him, as that bond between him and Kratos grow, and it was an amazing. To me, I see him and Kratos at one end on the escort Olympics, and at the other end, I think of Resident Evil 4. And
with Ashley?
With Ashley.
Yeah, until she gets a suit of armor, then she's fine. She she just hang out.
Yeah.
That's funny. Yeah, he was written very well by Matt and Rich, and they cast him really well. I actually joined just after they finished casting Kratos and Atreus, so I can't claim any credit for casting Sonny.
Right.
In fact, I think the casting department strongly suggested not to go with a child actor because of how difficult it would be.
Right.
I mean, think about it. Like, the game took 5 years to make. They cast him, I think, around year 4. He was like 9, I think, when they cast him. So it's kind of a very... let's just say there's a lot of puberty going on in that time, and a lot of growth happening.
There's you run the risk of
lots of changes
change.
happening to your body between 9 and 13.
Right.
To Corey's credit, he stuck with his vision. He didn't think that a actor who plays children would be able to capture the essence of a child.
Yeah.
And I still don't know if that's true, but I do think that something about having a really good child actor.
Oh, and he was outstanding
as that role. He and even in because I did a lot of the combat chatter sessions with him, and I've done a lot of combat chatter sessions working in the game industry, and he was better than a lot of adults that I've worked with.
That's amazing.
He was really good. And I think that's part of one reason he's resonated so much is that, well, he's written well, the actor is good, he's kind of got this just really endearing, empathetic quality, and he's cool. He's just a cool kid.
Yeah. That's something that makes it, even more worthwhile is when you get to work with people that you just enjoy being around, and that's something special.
Although it's funny because there are certain points in the game, I think I'll call out the what's it called in game? The storeroom.
Yeah.
When he recorded Fafnir's storeroom mission,
Yeah.
he definitely had a cold. So I listened to that one now. I was like, oh yeah, I remember that day, because
you can tell the difference.
Yeah. No, he was a good kid. He's also a hell of a skateboarder.
Oh.
So if you follow him on Instagram, you'll see some great skateboarding videos.
Nice.
Yeah.
So going into this, would you have considered yourself like a God of War fan had you played the previous titles?
Yeah, actually, I remember when the first one came out, and I played it, and I think it was it the original PlayStation God of War?
I think it was PS2.
PS2? It was like a... I don't know if it was a launch title, but it was an early PS2 title.
It was very early PS2, yeah.
Yeah, and I remember playing that and loving it. I think I remember buying the second one used, and it didn't work, so I never got to play the second one.
Right.
Which I've heard is the best of the series, so that's unfortunate.
Yeah.
But then when the third one came out, I really enjoyed that, and I replayed it just after I got hired as a writer, just to sort of get back into that character's mindset, even though we really don't use much from
and that's something series. I found interesting about the game is that because I played the first God of War. I think
anybody who had a PlayStation, and liked action games, had played a God of War because it's an action title. It's just a fun, brutal button masher.
Yeah, and I think credit to the writing team. You guys did an amazing job with Kratos. He's accessible on two different levels, I felt, in the game. Whereas if you had played and loved not only the three main titles, but all six titles, to be honest, before this one, you got one level of, okay, I kind of see his growth, how he changed, right?
Yeah.
But if you're not totally familiar with God of War, somebody like myself who had played God of War 1 when it came out, however long ago that was, over 10 years ago.
Yeah.
You're like, it was still accessible to someone like me who was like, okay, I understand him on a different level. I understood him actually as a father. I mean, that was one thing that really spoke to me was his relationship with his son, and just the trials of trying to relate to a kid. I mean, it's tough. I mean, I'm not Kratos and so far removed as he was at the beginning.
I guarantee you that you're a better father than Kratos is.
Thanks.
At least you could, whatever happens with your son or daughter, at least you know that you're going to be a better father than Kratos.
It's an easy bar to clear.
Yeah, exactly.
So did you spend any time researching Norse mythology, or had that process kind of been done and you're just kind of given a packet of, here's what we're focusing on? I
was definitely, well, the first thing I was given was the script as it was, and I read through that a couple times. Then I was pointed to a wonderful website called Norse Mythology for Smart People. And it just sort of very nicely sums up a bunch of different myths. And kind of, it's just, a little more readable than Wikipedia.
It's like a Cliff's Notes of Norse mythology.
Pretty much. And then when this was right around the time Neil Gaiman's book came out called Norse Mythology.
Right.
And so I read that and didn't relate that much to what I was working on, but it's also a nice read, sort of got me into the mindset.
Right.
And then there was a couple things. I think I tried reading the Prose Edda, didn't get very far. Did just a bunch of different random internet search when I was looking for like a name for one of the characters or something. I didn't do a ton of Norse mythology research, although I did learn how to speak ancient Norse.
Oh.
I don't know the language, but I can read it.
And I imagine, was that something with the battle chatter? Yes.
So all the revenants and not the Valkyries, the trolls, maybe some other characters, they speak ancient Norse. I had a ancient Norse to English dictionary, so I would find fireball, which I think is Bolverot or something like that.
Right.
And then I also found a YouTube video of this guy. I think his name is Jackson Crawford. That could be wrong, but he's a professor and he speaks ancient Norse, and he has a whole video on how to pronounce the weird diphthongs and umlauts. And so I watched that a bunch of times and had to direct actors in voiceover sessions on how to pronounce these words.
Right.
And some of them really took to it. Others, it was very challenging. But by the end of it, I could read ancient Norse pretty cleanly, which was cool.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, I had fun doing that.
So what was the most difficult part of production?
I don't know I can't think of what the most difficult thing was, but I can list off a couple of difficult things.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's challenging working on such a large team because coordination is nearly impossible on that large of a scale, but we do our best. And, the game really, it was so big, and up until around November, December of 2016, it was not very finished. It would crash a lot and it didn't seem very fun. And I was getting kind of worried. And then something in around November, December just kind of clicked into place. I think it was a lot of different departments finally sort of coming together and putting in their more finished work together. So I guess the challenging part of that was for about a year, I was writing for an unfinished game that I wasn't sure was going to be very good.
Right.
There's a lot riding on it. And, I had a lot of doubts about Corey's vision, and that have been proven completely wrong. Right. So it's nice to know that Well, it's humbling to have been proven wrong on certain things. I like the the first day I got to play a build of the game. It was at Freya's garden, when you pick the flowers, and it was like buggy and crashing, and I thought, like, really? Like, we're going from like a hardcore button masher to picking flowers? They are going to eat us alive.
Right.
And I couldn't see the full picture, right? I was only seeing certain parts and not knowing how it was going to fit together.
Right.
But Corey knew what the full picture was going to look like. And to his credit, he stuck with his vision for 5 years. I don't know how he was able to do that. But so it was challenging to sort of to be optimistic about it at first.
Right.
That ended, later in the year when I started to see some of these cinematics come together, and the combat started to get really fun, and they sort of figured out what the reward loops were going to be like.
Right.
I'd also say that the designers that were working with are all extremely talented, and oftentimes would change things to make the game more fun, and they needed to happen.
Right.
But it f***ed me over a lot. And things that I had written had to get changed and adapted and adjusted, and lines had to be cut and rewritten, and it was just a constant barrage of, well, this isn't playtesting well, we need to put this here. Okay, well, then now I have to rewrite this line. And that part was extremely challenging. But, the game has to be fun.
Right.
And
above all. And the, narrative counts for a lot. The story has to be good. And Matt and Rich were fighting their own battles with Critical Path. But for exploration, this was kind of an afterthought, and nobody had really scoped it. So there was a lot of it, and it was changing a lot, and keeping track of where everything was going was very, very challenging. Yeah. I mean, I can only imagine. With something with that much. I mean, obviously you announced God of War. What was it? Last year's E3. When the first trailers came out, if I recall correctly. But that was with the choir coming out on stage with the chant.
I think that was 2 years ago.
Was that 2 years ago? It might have actually,
yeah.
It was 2 years ago. So that was before.
Yeah, the choir was 2 years ago.
So the choir was 2 years ago, and from your point of view, that's even before the game had kind of clicked in.
Yeah, actually, yes, because that was, I think they showed the hunting scene.
Right.
And there were still a bunch of mechanics that, like, I think originally, well, no, some stuff did carry through. Like, there was like a language experience meter, which eventually turned into the cipher pieces that you collect. There's a bunch of things that, and you'll notice, you'll still see, like, when you get to that scenario, I'm peeling back the curtain a little bit, but when early on the "Do not be sorry, be better" sequence,
right,
you'll see the lighting shift a bit when Kratos hops over the branch, and then it shifts into the him missing the deer. Like, the lighting on that is a little different than the scene before because that was sort of like a sprint, like an alpha sprint,
right,
of, let's get this looking really good for E3. And yeah, the game was not in the best of shapes at that point. I actually wasn't on the game at that point. I wouldn't have been hired for another 8 months or so,
right,
from that point. But there was a lot of work to do after that reveal. Man, and it came a long way.
Did the concept, so the single camera, the single take, basically, did that influence the way you did your job at all?
I'd say only for writing cinematics in the quests. So in our, we called them the B quests, all the dwarven favors.
Right.
We had a budget, essentially of one cinematic per each of those. And so when writing those cinematics, I had to take in consideration how the player was entering a room, how they were going to leave the cinematic, keeping in mind that, how to write the staging, because whipping back and forth between Kratos and Atreus is just not good camera work.
Right.
And Dori Arazi, I hope I'm saying that right, the director of photography, he was very quick to sort of point out, like, this scene, the way you have written, it's not quite going to work because single camera.
Right.
So that was the only challenge I faced with that. I also want to say about it that I thought it was very gimmicky when I first heard about it. Again,
Right.
Proven wrong. Playing it myself, it is really effective at keeping you immersed. And
Yep.
I didn't realize that until I did a full playthrough myself.
Yeah, it was one of those things where I was like, okay, well, we'll see how this turns out.
It sounds gimmicky, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I've seen the I sat in cinematography class when they were showing the single take movies. I
Sure.
it was like, yeah, there's, you got Hitchcock with rope, and it'd be like, well, it's not really a single take, et cetera, et cetera. But so I didn't really buy into it until you fight the stranger who you come to know as Baldur at the beginning, and I was like, oh, okay, I'm feeling it now, because you just never. It's the story.
It never pulls away.
Right.
Yeah.
The story is told so strongly from Kratos' point of view.
Yeah.
Especially in those opening moments.
Yeah.
That once you get into that fight, you realize, all right, this works. This is working for me.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was something that took me, I forget, that fight happens like maybe an hour into the game.
Yeah, pretty soon.
Yeah. So yeah, it was something that I wasn't sure about, but then it made me a believer.
Yeah. Yeah, me too. Me too.
So, Adam, final question. So what are your plans for the future? Because I know you're no longer in LA.
Correct. Yes. So I am currently in Amsterdam. My contract ended in February. And I recently was hired at Guerrilla Games,
cool.
The fine makers of Horizon Zero Dawn.
Cool.
So I've been hired as a writer, and I am working on an unannounced project from that studio. Yeah, and one day I'll be able to talk about it.
Of course. I imagine anything that comes out after Horizon Zero Dawn, it will be met with much hype and anticipation.
Yes, it's very exciting. It's been, what I can talk about is, I guess this is the earliest I've been on a project before, where we're still sort of in that transition between pre-production and production.
Right.
And it's really interesting to see and I've never been on a title this early before. I've always come in traditionally at the end when things are on fire and it's all hands on deck, and people are desperate for help. And so now I kind of get to be at the start of a major undertaking, and it's fascinating. It's different challenges, than, because we're not crunching, we're going home at decent hours every day, and it's interesting.
Cool.
Yeah.
No, I'm excited to hear more about it when you are legally allowed to talk about it.
Me too.
All right, Adam, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, man. Thanks for setting this up. This was a pleasure.
That will do it for this episode of the Arcadology podcast. If you enjoyed this, make sure to comment and subscribe with notifications so you don't miss future episodes. I recently posted a video about the development history of Suikoden, and the link to it will be available in the description below. Thanks for watching, and take care.